Indie games, indie games, indie games. Recently here on the channel, I made a video going over the best things about every indie game. At least every indie game that I've played, and that video did very well. So predictably, today we're going to be doing the opposite. What is the worst thing about every indie game? Please remember that just because I criticize these games, doesn't mean I do not like them. Most of these games I really like, which is why I initially talked about the best parts about them. And before we get into it, shout out to my channel members who help keep this channel running. Shout out to HUD, Tomfoolery, and Morrow. All channel members get shouted out in new videos, so thank you for supporting. Let's get into the list. Just like the first video on the topic, we're going to be going in alphabetical order, so let's begin with Animal Well. To be honest, there's not really any bad parts about this game, at least from what I remember. Be sure to let me know in the comments what you think is bad about it, but I think I may just cop out and say that the combat is the worst part, and it's kinda an unfair criticism because this game isn't really trying to have good combat, but look, it's the best criticism I've got. Maybe that's the sign this game is perfect. Let me know. Moving on to Blasphemous, a game I've been covering a lot lately. The worst thing about Blasphemous for me is probably going to be the missable content. Let me explain. There are a few things in this game that if you don't do on time or correctly, you'll need to make a separate save file to reattempt. For example, there's this guy in the snowy mountain area of the game who is like attached to a tree or something, and he wants to feel oil before he succumbs to his condition. And if you don't get that oil fast enough, you won't be able to reach a certain area, meaning you can no longer get 100% map completion unless you make a new save file, which I find to be rather infuriating, especially given it's no easy task to retrieve the oil in time. Aside from that, there is a really annoying area in Blasphemous, but that might just be a skill issue. I've kind of been reaching for straws on the first two entries, but don't worry, we'll have plenty of criticisms to some of the games on this list. Moving on to Blasphemous II. People have a lot of nitpicks for this game, but I once again just don't have any real issues. I'm just gonna go with the fact that the side content in this game isn't as memorable, nor as good, as it is in the first game. I still remember almost all the characters and side quests from the first Blasphemous, but in Blasphemous II, the only things I remember from the side content is trading items, and oh yeah, I think I forgot trading items. I think another thing that helps out the first Blasphemous in this department is that it had its awesome crossover with Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, where we got to see the main character of that game, and we also got a couple really fun platforming challenges. And spoiler alert, that's the game we're going to talk about next. Okay, so next up is Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, and this is the first choice of the video that is insanely easy. The worst part about this game is by far the art style. This right here is why 2D games should not try to look three-dimensional. I know people get tired of seeing the pixel graphics everywhere, but there's a reason it's overused. It's because it works. This, on the other hand, pardon my French, but this is just hideous. Maybe there's some people that feel differently, but I just think the graphics look so awkward. And the animations are atrociously bad too. Bloodstained is still a good game, but this is definitely the worst part about it. But let me know if you actually like the art style for some reason. I might completely disagree, but I don't judge. Okay, coming up next is going to be Dead Cells, another masterpiece of a game, so let's see what I can come up with. I think I'm just going to say the worst part about Dead Cells is simply the weapon balancing, and here's the thing, it's not even really that bad. However, I just have absolutely nothing else to complain about, and weapon balancing is something that's really difficult to perfect, so we're just going to go with that. You're always going to have weapons that are better than others, but I just feel like overall, there are still some decently broken weapons in Dead Cells, and because of that, this is all I can really come up with for the game. It's simply a testament to how good it is. Next up is Deltarune, and I gotta be honest, I'm not too big on this game. I'll probably play through the full game when it eventually releases, but until then, I'm not gonna revisit it. There's not really anything bad about it though. I'm gonna be honest, I just can't think of anything here. Granted, I haven't played too much of Deltarune since there's only 2 chapters, at least as I'm recording this. I'm just gonna say the worst part about it is that it isn't finished. That should suffice for now. Besides, I'm sure once the game fully releases, I'll have something to bitch about. Moving on to Ender Lilies, quietly one of the best Metroidvanias ever made. However, for this list, I'm gonna say the worst thing about it is the memorability. I played through the entire game last year, but compared to other games, I just don't have that many core memories with Ender Lilies. I still think it's a masterpiece in terms of game design, but I'll probably have to go back and revisit it sometime. Maybe the narrative just wasn't relatable to me or something. I just can't really put a finger on why I didn't remember that much about it. So yeah, maybe I'll revisit it, but for now, memorability is a fine choice. Coming up next is Hollow Knight, another masterpiece of a Metroidvania. And yes, I've played a lot of these kinds of games. Now, I remember this game much more, probably because I played through it a couple times, rather than just once. I think one thing I noticed during my playthroughs of Hollow Knight is that the charm balancing isn't very good. Now, as I said when I was talking about Dead Cells, balancing issues is something that a ton of games struggle with. It's something that isn't easy to fix. And unfortunately, that's my only real issue with Hollow Knight. Some of the charms you can equip in this game are genuinely just bad for no reason, and it's fairly obvious that they could have just used a bit more tweaking. Some of these charms are literally just unusable. So yeah, fairly easy decision right here. And next up is another Metroidvania, Islets. Now this is a Metroidvania that is a bit on the easier side. Most of the time these games aim to be pretty difficult. However, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing about the game. And overall, I don't have many negative things to say about Islets. I'm gonna say that the worst part about it is the presentation. And what I mean by that is it's kinda just the combination of the visuals, the music, and sound effects. I don't think that they're that bad, but me and my friend both played through this game, and we both agreed it kinda reminds us of a mobile game. It's just the aesthetic itself can be kinda cheesy, and same thing with the sound effects and music. I like some of the music, and the game still looks pleasant visually. But yeah, I think you're starting to notice a pattern with this video. A lot of the indie games I've played are just really solid and don't have many issues. We're now about halfway through the list, so we're gonna take a short break to talk about today's controller review, the NYXI Hyperion II, which is a wireless Nintendo Switch controller, just like the Joy-Cons, except bigger, more comfortable, and with great button quality. I know I have a lot of you guys in the audience that play on Nintendo Switch, and I also know that you guys agree with me that the default Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons are kinda garbage. So because of that, I've been on the hunt to find the best replacement for these things. And let me just say, this controller is a great candidate for this. So NYXI sent me these controllers after I reached out to them asking to review it on the channel. Now, this is not a sponsored segment, this is only a review, with a little bonus at the end. So these are my genuine opinions after using these Joy-Cons. The NYXI Hyperion 2 features Hall effect joysticks, meaning it will never have Joy-Con drift. It also has mechanical buttons, and the best way I can describe them is that they sound like the click of a gaming mouse. And also, something I didn't even know until I read the back of the box is that you can take off the magnetic cover, which I guess is cool. And the controller also has customizable RGB lighting, which you can change to your liking. What I like about this controller is that it's lightweight and low profile, but at the same time, it's really premium feeling in your hands. I just really like the way the grip feels on the back, and obviously, just like the regular Joy-Cons, you can use them wirelessly in dock mode, or attach them to the console and use it in handheld mode, which is my personal recommendation. I've been testing these things out over the past week, and whether you're raging at Mario Kart against friends, or doing some tricky platforming in Donkey Kong Country, these controllers have my stamp of approval. Now, even though I do still think this controller is more comfortable than the basic Joy-Con, there is one thing that I really wish these things came with, and that's its own extra grip for the wireless mode. It's just a bit stubby to use like this, because you might just lose your grip on it on accident. It's just nice to have something firm in between the Joy-Cons if you're going to use them like this. It's still completely usable, but I prefer to use these in dock mode because of this. Now, as for the price point, we're looking at a $79.99 controller, which is the same price as the standard Joy-Cons, and if I'm being honest, if I were you, I'd go for these, especially since it helps me. If you use code Wyvern on NYXI's website, that's NYXIGame.com, you'll get 10% off your purchase. That's code Wyvern at checkout for 10% off on the NYXI Hyperion 2 on NYXIGame.com. I'm gonna give these controllers around an 8.5 out of 10. They feel awesome in handheld mode, and while they could use an extra attachment for wireless mode, they're still very usable. Thank you to NYXI for sending me these controllers, and thank you to them for providing you guys with a 10% off coupon. Thank you for listening, and let's get back to the list. So next up is going to be a game called Just Shapes and Beats. I like to describe this game like it's like Undertale and Geometry Dash combined into one, and this game is pretty awesome. Not much to complain about, although the game hasn't really given me a reason to go back and replay it, which I'm not necessarily complaining because I usually like to just move on to something new, but this is what I can come up with. Just Shapes and Beats is one of those games that you really enjoy and then just kinda never revisit afterwards. At least, that's what it seems like to me. And so next up is going to be Lethal Company. As much as I loved Lethal Company for its craziness, it's unfortunately got one thing that's holding me back from revisiting it. It just gets really repetitive. Now, I know that you can use mods to make the game more fun, but usually I only count the vanilla version itself, so it's been a few months since we've hopped on Lethal Company, because we've simply seen everything there is to see. Even some of the recent updates haven't been interesting to me. Sure, they added that mineshaft area that's kinda neat, but I don't even prefer it to any other map in the game. So my issue with Lethal Company is gonna be the replayability. Coming up next is gonna be The Messenger, which is a game I talk about a lot because it's a game that starts as a regular platformer and ends as a Metroidvania. There are a couple less than ideal things about the game though, one of them being the repetitive enemies, but for my pick for the worst thing about the game, I think I'm gonna go with the padded runtime. It is still a pretty short game, but there's a couple parts where you're almost forced to run through areas you've already been in just to reach a different area, and this is just boring and wastes a few minutes of your time when it happens. And yes, a lot of Metroidvanias have unnecessary backtracking, but in The Messenger, it just really adds absolutely nothing. Not much else to add really. As good as the game is, sometimes it just wastes your time. And so now we talk about Nine Souls. The worst part about this Metroidvania is going to be the exploration, and that's most likely because this game is more so focused on the combat and bosses. The map system in this game just isn't as good as other games from this genre, and the world design in general is relatively linear in comparison. I mean, it's not like this is horrible or anything. If I want to explore in a Metroid-like setting, I have tons of other games for that, but Nine Souls on the other hand, it mostly succeeds in giving you some of the best boss fights you'll experience in gaming. It's just not good at exploration. Up next is Pizza Tower, a really creative 2D platformer with innovative level design. Now, with that in mind, I think the one complaint I have is that the game drags just a little bit before the final few levels. The levels in this game start out pretty unique because the game introduces its main gimmick, which is, after you get through the level, you have to speedrun back to the entrance. It's really cool, and is always the part that you look forward to in these levels. However, because of the dragging that goes on around halfway through, these levels can be kind of boring sometimes, and that's my only complaint. Coming up next is going to be Sea of Stars, and even though I love this game, the worst part about it is fairly obvious. In order to get the true ending of Sea of Stars, one of the requirements is to find 60 random scattered collectibles that serve no purpose other than to force you to backtrack. Now, if you're paying attention during your playthrough, you'll already have obtained the majority of these already, but if you slip up for a couple hours, it's going to be annoying to find these. There is technically a way to track them, but it's just unnecessary padded runtime. So yeah, the two games Sabotage Studios have made so far, they both struggle with basically the same thing, padded runtime. But now we move on to Shovel Knight. Now, I'm kind of contemplating what I'm going to choose for this entry, because I could go with the fact that the movement is kind of clunky, but that's also kind of by design because it's supposed to control like an NES game. You know what, I'm just going to go with that. The game is great, but can definitely feel a bit stiff to control in comparison to other platformers, even platformers that adopt a similar art style. So yeah, Shovel Knight is one of the best indie games. I just wish that maybe it could control a little bit better. What I am about to say about Stardew Valley may be a bit of a hot take, but hey, that's why you're here, I guess. The worst thing about Stardew Valley is going to be the multiplayer. Now, don't get it twisted, I've played a lot of multiplayer Stardew Valley, but every time I play, the same problem occurs. In Stardew Valley, time is the most valuable currency. This game can even be stressful with how little time you have to do your chores. And that's even worse in multiplayer where time goes faster because it's harder to pause the timer since there's multiple people. I just think that it could be a bit more forgiving for the players. Maybe make time go by a little bit slower in multiplayer, or at least give us a slider that can adjust that. Either way, Stardew Valley is an amazing game. The multiplayer isn't bad, but it is something that I wish could be a bit improved. And moving on to Stray, a perfect example of a quality over quantity game, and because of that, I kinda have to reach and say the worst part about it is the platforming, which is pretty insane to say because it's a platformer, but let's be real, this game succeeds at being immersive. The gameplay in this game, it has its moments, but a lot of the platforming just consists of look at an object and press X. It's not objectively bad, it's just if you're gonna call it a platformer, I mean that's like calling me a professional baseball player because I played in middle school. But yeah, there's not much wrong with Stray, so this should do. Okay, so next is Super Meat Boy. There was only one problem I had with this game, and it was this one boss fight that was just completely horrible. I have nothing else to say. There was one terrible boss fight, that's it. Let's move on. Moving on to Terraria. It's the best indie game ever made, but I will say, this game is impossible for new players in 2025. Back in version 1.2, the game was not as good, but it was also easier to pick up and play if you're just getting used to it. Now, on the other hand, if you're looking to get into Terraria, you're gonna have to put some work in. Terraria is unforgiving against new players, and if you want to learn more about that, I recommend this video by my friend Hudson J. Head over there if you're interested. And next up is the Angry Video Game Nerd I II Deluxe, which is a mouthful to say the least. I want to start by saying if you haven't seen the Angry Video Game Nerd before, first of all, you're really young, and second of all, you need to pause this video and type that into the YouTube search bar right now and check it out, because it's the main reason that channels like mine exist today. With that being said, the Angry Video Game Nerd video games are surprisingly pretty good. However, it doesn't change the fact that they're designed to piss you off. I mean, it's by design and all, but you can't lie and say that these levels have never made you mad. I mean, these can be ridiculous at times. There's not really anything else about this game specifically that I need to complain about. It's exactly what I wanted, even if it's rage-inducing. Coming up next is finally Undertale. When talking about the worst thing about Undertale, many people say it's the graphics, which even though I understand why it looks bland to others, I think that that's rather subjective, even though I criticize Bloodstained Ritual of the Night for that exact thing, but let's just forget about that. Instead, I'm gonna go with the overworld gameplay, which once again isn't too bad, but the character movement is pretty slow, but once again, it's not really a huge deal, since the game is short anyway, so it's not like the game suffers from bad pacing. It's just a bit less stimulating to look at, I guess. Can you tell I'm a zoomer? And the last game of the video is going to be Voidwrought, a fun Metroidvania game that the developers were kind enough to give me a Steam key for. But now that the game's been out for a few months, the worst thing about it is going to be its lack of identity. Unfortunately, this game just lives in the shadow of the game it was inspired by, Hollow Knight, which we talked about earlier. It's a pretty good game on its own, but I just feel like there's not much to get excited about when you compare these two games. Of course, there are other Metroidvanias that were inspired by Hollow Knight, but these games also had their own reasons to play them. Whereas, for a game like Voidwrought, I just feel like it's not much more than a watered down version of Hollow Knight. I mean, even the protagonist is similar. Still a good game on its own. I just wish that there were more reasons to really get invested in it. And there you go. That was the list for the worst thing about every indie game. It was a bit difficult for me to choose things to critique about these games, but I wanted to at least attempt to make a video like this, since I already ranked the best things. Thank you to NYXI for allowing me to review their Joy-Cons. Make sure to use my code for a discount. Let me know what you thought about the list. What did you agree on? What did you disagree on? Also, I forgot to include a game called Gravity Circuit in this video. It's the most recent indie game I finished, so yeah, unfortunately I forgot to cover it, but that's alright because it's an absolute masterpiece, meaning it would be difficult for me to find an issue with it. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll talk to you again soon.